All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? So my name is Ron Davies. I'm the head of economics here at UCD, and I would just like to welcome everybody to the celebration of the work and the many, many, many contributions of Peter Neary, not just to sort of economic research and international trade in particular, but in particular to the way econ is done in Ireland. I think it's a fair thing to say that he really revolutionized the way economic research is done in UCD and in Ireland more broadly. And so what we're going to do today is just take some time to look back on some of the various contributions he's made to the different aspects of the literature and the ways he's influenced Ireland in terms of economic research here. But before we do that, I think it's equally important for us to sort of acknowledge the fact that a lot of us aren't necessarily here because of his economic research, because Peter's not generally just the smartest guy in the room. He's also generally one of the nicest guys. From a grad student at their very first conference to a seasoned road dog, he's always there with the constructive comments and that bit of encouragement. And I think in addition to his many, many, many excellent pieces of research, he's got an enduring legacy in terms of his infectious excitement for all of this. He helps us remember how much fun doing economic research really, really can be. And so we're going to hear from co-authors, colleagues, and comrades about his work. And this is just a chance for us to really express our gratitude for everything that he's been giving to us. So to start things off, I'm going to pass things over and let Joe Stiglitz say a little bit, and then we'll move on from there. Joe, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. And you've really said something that I feel so strongly, that he's not only one of the smartest, he's one of the nicest people. I'm also in a slightly different position. I was also his teacher. I came to Oxford in 1976, and I see on the screen some other students I had. It was a fantastic group of students, and among that fantastic group of students was Peter, that made those 3 years I spent at Oxford really, for me, one of the most exciting 3 years of my life. And Peter and I became both very good friends and co-authors. So I'm going to speak now in the role of co-author. I know I'm in the midst of a mostly trade fraternity, and I've not really been as much a part of that fraternity as we did work in macroeconomics, and Ron thought it might be good at the beginning to talk, remind people of some of his earlier work in macroeconomics, which was about moving away from the Walrasian general equilibrium to macroeconomics, where there were rationing constraints, where there were constraints on mobility. Interestingly, those ideas that he began to write about in the late 70s with Roberts and with me are now coming back again. And including, as I say, ration equilibrium and immobility of factors. In the COVID-19, we've seen one of the big issues has been the immobility of factors from the sectors which have been very badly affected, like the service sector, to other sectors. Now, very big differences between these rationing equilibria and the Walrasian equilibrium. At the time, the theoretical foundations of the rationing equilibrium were not as strong as they are today. We now have better theories explaining why prices don't adjust, why markets don't clear. But it was very evident then that many markets didn't clear, and that therefore individuals, firms, were often in this rationing equilibrium. The particular paper that I wrote with that Peter and I, a couple papers, one of which was published, the other one has never been, wanted to go back to it, focused on an issue that was a policy issue that was very big at the time. It was the era of new classical economics, and real business cycle, beginning of real business cycle, where people were arguing that government policy wasn't effective, that with rational expectations, people would always undo what the government did. And therefore, both monetary and fiscal policy was ineffective. And our particular contribution was to try to parse out, was it rational expectations that was driving the result, or was it something else? And the result was, it was something else. It was the assumption that markets were clearing. So what we did was to construct a multi-period, two-period model where there was rationing, and with rational expectations. We also looked at non-rational expectations, but with rational expectations, where we showed that instead of government policy being less effective with rational expectations, it was actually more effective, that multipliers were larger. And that was one of the things that also Peter had explored in some of his other work. So that, in fact, government policy could, as I say, multipliers were larger, and therefore government intervention was more powerful than in the absence of rational expectations. Well, let me just conclude by saying this has given rise or been followed by two major strands of research that have gone on over the subsequent 45 years. One of them was a strand which emphasizes what might be called macroeconomic externalities in the presence of price and wage rigidities, and more generally in the presence of market imperfections. This is a strand of work that Anton Kornak, Fari, and Moering, and a large number of other people have emphasized. What it means is that what happens in one sector can have very big effects on others. And that's why encouraging investment today can have effects in later periods and on other groups in society. So this whole I think you can call that we're the precursor of this large literature on macroeconomic externalities. The second thing, which is very closely related, is that once one recognizes the presence of these externalities that arise in the presence of rationing, in the presence of price and wage rigidities, in the presence of also information imperfections and imperfect risk markets, one realizes that the competitive equilibrium is not efficient. So the invisible hand theorems don't hold. The first welfare theorem doesn't hold. And that, of course, is of profound importance, because it then gives not only a statement that government policy can be powerful, but it also says the government intervention is desirable because markets won't on their own be efficient. And that has provided some of the intellectual foundations for much of the theoretical work in the role of government, particularly in the context of macroeconomics, but in other areas going forward. So it was very early in his career, before he got so immersed in trade. I always thought he had a good future as a good macro theorist, but he managed to have a good career in doing work in trade as well. So it was a loss as from the perspective of general theory, macro theory, but it was a gain to both Ireland and to the trade fraternity.
Great, thanks for that, Joe. Yeah, I think the part I appreciated the most out of that was knowing that you and Peter had papers that didn't publish as well. Makes me feel a little bit better about myself. So, let's move into the trade discussion. So first off, we're going to talk a bit about factor mobility and trade policy. So Tony Venables and Jim Anderson are going to lead that discussion there. So Tony, if you want to step in and begin.
Yes, good. Thank you, Ron, and thanks to all the organisers of this great event. Most of the people speaking this afternoon have co-authored with Peter. I never have. We talked about it once or twice, but never sort of came together. However, I have known him for a really very long time. Obviously, the last 14 years or so, we've been colleagues in Oxford. Before that, there was a period of many decades where it was professional interaction through conferences, professional meetings, and above all, the CEPR. Peter was the founding director of the International Trade Programme, the CEPR, and the trade was one of the CEPR's first programs. So he was in there right at the beginning, getting the CEPR going. And of course, he attended IRWIT, that trade conference, for I don't know how many years, consecutively attending that. And he took over the after dinner speeches, which were always memorable, and they were always very, just very Peter. He did them with aplomb, shall I say. Great wit and that enormous sort of energy and vitality and charm, coming through these speeches. Absolutely wonderful. But anyway, that only takes us to the early 1980s, 1983 that was set up. So I first met Peter in 1974. We were graduate students in Oxford together through the period 74, 78. And Oxford graduate program was pretty good then. I mean, it had been reformed by Merleys, who took a pretty tight, disciplined approach. So we learned a lot of microeconomics. Actually, not very much macro, with due respect to the previous speaker. Well, maybe that's why it was innovative when it was being done. Anyway, so it was Merleys, essentially Merleys' degree, and then young Stiglitz turned up in 76, I think. So I go back with Peter, well, to 1974, a long time. So I want to discuss, some of his early work on factor mobility, factor market distortions, Dutch disease, and a little bit on getting into his work on duality. But let me start with what is perhaps his best known paper, and one that truly deserves the title classic. That's the one with Max Gordon, the Dutch disease paper, Booming Sector and Deindustrialization, published in '82. Well, why do I call it classic? Well, and the starting point for that, I guess, is just look at the numbers. Over 4,000 citations. And I had a look to see how they tailed off through time. And what did I find? I find that 38 years on or whatever, 39 years on, it's getting about 300 citations a year. So I think, after, pushing half a century here, getting that many citations, it deserves the title. What it does is, the question is, well, what's the effect of a resource boom in an economy? And I guess it was motivated by North Sea oil, which was a big deal at that point. And he set up the analysis in terms of two effects, the spending effect and the resource movement effect. But it's the spending effect that I think is the really sort of crucial element here. Now, the key is that spending effect and the impact of that working through the equilibrium on the economy. And I guess most people would come to that, or even today, talking to policymakers, people come to that by thinking, oh, we've got all this extra foreign exchange, so that's probably going to appreciate the exchange rate. So we've got to work out an import demand elasticity and an export supply elasticity and goodness knows what, and find out the exchange rate change and then work out the effect of that on the economy. Whereas, of course, Peter said, no, really. There's a resource constraint in the economy. This is extra spending on non-tradables, so it will crowd out the tradable sector. Pose the question the right way, as Peter did. If it has that effect, then there will be deindustrialization, there will be a Dutch disease, and the mechanism through which that arises is an exchange rate appreciation. But just sort of inverting, getting people to think about the problem in that sort of radically different way, really shed, well, made it a lot easier and created a great deal of insight, I think, and really important insight that leads into policy. Thinking about managing a resource boom, you need to think about how you're saving, spending, smoothing the revenue, be it in building, sovereign wealth funds or shorter run macroeconomic management. And Peter went on to do some work with Doug Purvis, Van Bergen, taking those ideas in a more macro direction. And obviously the mechanisms there have been important for thinking about resource booms, but also aid agencies worry about the Dutch disease effects, economies with lots of remittances. So it's a really powerful way of thinking about a really important and pretty common phenomenon. I reread that paper a couple of weeks ago. Rereading it, actually the spending effect is not particularly at the forefront of the paper. There's a lot on the resource movement effect. That is, that the resource sector itself might be demanding labour and capital, might be using resources. There's a lot on how results depend on intersectoral factor mobility. There's quite a lot on the income distributional implications. So the spending effect is only part of the story, but it is the crucial part. And I think the point here is that sort of crucial element, crucial way of thinking has taken on a life of its own. And that's what really makes it a classic paper. It's not just the count of citations and things, it's that it changed the way people thinking. So that sort of core germ of an idea came out and got evolved, changed, adapted, but it's really comes back from that very influential paper. Okay, so that's what I wanted to start with, but let me go back. That was 82. Let me go back a little bit earlier to 1978, which I think is the year he actually completed his thesis. So yeah, he'd been thinking a lot about capital mobility, factor mobility between sectors, intersectoral factor mobility. So there's this economic journal paper, Short Run Capital Specificity and the Pure Theory of International Trade, in the Economic Journal in September 1978. Let me give you a flavour for that one as well. What it's doing is saying, well, we've got the Hector-Olin model, and we've got the specific factors model. And it's natural to think of the Hector-Olin model as a long-run version of the specific factors. It's natural to think of them as being, or in some sense, temporally linked. Capital doesn't adjust in the short run, but can move across sectors in the long run. So what the paper does is really just a systematic, careful, elegant study of the comparative statics of those two models. And then the implicit dynamics. If one model is giving one comparative static, another is giving another comparative static, there's an implicit dynamic, obviously, in that short run, long run connection between the two. So he works that through. The main point, I don't want to get too much into economic arguments here, but let me run it past you anyway. The main point is that one of the sectors is, by definition, relatively capital unintensive, but does have capital as a specific factor. So we know that if the price of output in that sector goes up, the return to that capital will go up in the short run. But it's a sector that's unintensive in capital. So as Stolper Samuelson kicks in the longer run, capital is going to lose in that sector. So we know that for at least one of the factors in this economy, there'll be a sign change in the effect of comparative statics as we go from the short run to the long run. So Peter worked all that through very carefully, pointed out, went beyond that very nicely, pointing out the dual arguments. If that's true in price space, there's going to be an analog in quantity space from endowment changes to output changes. The real contribution of that paper, or the startling thing about that paper is that we have all, essentially, I think everyone on this call has either taught it or been taught it or both. We go through these models and we're looking to draw out some implications, why they matter, what the models tell us, and we all go through that example. I don't have a big stock of economics textbooks here at home with me at present, present circumstances, but I did look at a few, and yes, the economic textbooks, for 40 years on, more than 40 years on, cite that paper. So it's really been sort of profound in the way we think about, teach the subject. One comment on rereading the paper. I was rather surprised to find that the penultimate section, I think, is entitled "A Critique of the Assumption of Intersectoral Capital Mobility." So, Peter was really having a go at Hector-Olin. He thought specific factors was better. And the argument he makes is that, well, if it's about capital reallocation, then it's going to be a dynamic process involving saving and investment, and you better do it properly, not just in a sort of rather simple Hector-Olin way. I don't know whether he still takes that view. It obviously depends on how you interpret the two factors. If it's capital, I'm absolutely with him. If it's labour skills, maybe not. But anyway, I was surprised on rereading to see that. Okay, let me do one and a bit more of the papers I want to talk about very, very quickly here. Again, this is the year he completed his thesis, American Economic Review, Dynamic Stability and the Theory of Factor Market Distortions. So yeah, nice to have an AER the year you complete your thesis. But let me be very brief on this. I think it's the case that during the 1970s, there were a number of papers drawing out paradoxical results, paradoxical comparative statics that you could get out of trade models, Hector-Olin in particular. Indeed, I've followed up some references, and the second paper in volume 1 of the first issue of the first volume of the Journal of International Economics had one of these paradoxical papers by two very distinguished trade economists. You can probably guess who I'm talking about. So there was a bit of a sort of industry going on doing this stuff. So what does Peter do in this AER paper? He says, well, yes, you can get paradoxical results, and they're all around an unstable equilibrium. So they're of absolutely no practical interest. They're not observable. We're not going to see these things. So, so I think he did the profession of service there of killing this space of papers that otherwise was running well. I really don't want to go into detail on this. No, I won't. I definitely won't. Time is going on, but it just showed, Peter's ability to see through the problem. Yeah, I mean, there's something going on here, something else going on. Very elegant way of showing it. And there you are. Finally, let me just move to the later 1980s. And this is a bit by way of sort of passing over to Jim, Jim Anderson, who I know will pick up on some of these things a bit more. The papers I've been talking about so far, a great deal of the exposition if not the work underpinning it. A great deal of the exposition was diagrammatic. There are these, sort of trade diagrams that I personally find very, very difficult. But then that's changed quite radically in Peter's work and the way he certainly exposited it and wrote it during the course of the 80s. And some of that has to do with duality, which entered, well, the profession and trade theory in the early 1980s. I mean, in trade, it was Adam Woodland and Dixon and Norman principally. But Peter was very much an early mover in adopting and applying and extending those ideas. And in a sense, they fit very well with the way Peter thinks about problems, because you've got to have the tools for the problem, and duality often provides that. And Peter was good at spotting that. So a couple of, notably, very, very quickly, there's a very short AER paper in 1988, Determinants of the Equilibrium Real Exchange Rate. It does a number of things. It's a short paper. It redoes the Dutch disease analysis from the earlier paper with Corden, but in duality, you do it in kind of 3 lines of algebra. It's the way we all do it now. It's the way we teach and talk about it and think about it. So it really comes out, elegantly, nicely, and crisply. There's another paper actually written a bit earlier, 1986, with Albert Schweinberger. So he was working with Schweinberger at this point. It's called Factor Content Functions and the Theory of International Trade. What it does is develop indirect factor trade utility functions, which is a considerable mouthful. What they're doing is constructing a duality tool that enables you to think through some high dimensional Hector-Olin stuff in a nice, clear, elegant way. So basically, he extends some of Van Deerdorf sorts of results on correlations between between prices and factor contents of trade, but by developing the tool in duality that enables you to go straight to it. So again, very, very nice. Anyway, I really must stop now and hand over to Jim Anderson, who will pick up the story.
Okay, thank you, Tony, and thanks to the organizers for this opportunity to express my and our appreciation of Peter Neary's contributions to economics. Our appreciation of the other dimensions along which Peter affected our lives can, and I trust will, be expressed in other venues. So I'm going to restrict what I say today to how Peter's work in economics directly affected mine, mainly on our joint work on trade policy. Tony's nicely expressed our appreciation for many of Peter's other great papers, but I have to leave any rating of our joint work to others, not to it myself. So I want to stress, my main point here really is how deeply rewarding it was for me to work with Peter Neary as a co-author. By the time we met, we were already mature economists, but working with Peter felt like being back in grad school again, or a young economist again. So there was rapid learning, half-formed ideas bouncing back and forth, intuitions offered, maybe shot down, flawed insights exposed, and underlying it all, a kind of reinforcement of the zeal that we may have had for solving problems. I always feel smarter when I'm with Peter, but especially when we're actually working on something. I'm going to provide more detail about our work on trade policy, but my baseline here, musical sense, is the intrinsic rewards of the production process. Whatever recognition our output has received is gratifying, but in some way less important than the enjoyment of that process. Prior to meeting Peter, which was in 1988 during his visit to Queen's University, a big influence on my earlier work on quotas in the earlier 80s was his elegant 1980 paper with Kevin Roberts on virtual prices and rationing. Most recently, this same paper actually clarified my thinking in a 2020 paper that deals with choke prices and latent demand that's associated with the zero flows that are of concern in non-CES gravity models. So anyway, Peter and I met at a Midwest International Economics Conference in 1988. And over coffee at the first break, we shared our enthusiasm for Angus Deaton's distance function, which is an expression of this duality Tony was just talking about. It's the dual to the expenditure function. So this conversation immediately led us to work on an application using the distance function to evaluate trade efficiency in terms of trade quantities. The title of that paper, which was published in a festschrift for Bob Baldwin, was The Coefficient of Trade Utilization, which was a title nodding to De Breu. It's an obscure paper. No one cites it as far as I know. It still seems like a neat idea to me. But I don't think, besides any influence on us, that it's had much influence. At any rate, this was the start of a lengthy collaboration on developing index numbers of trade policy. So the practical motivation for our project was to remedy the glaring deficiency, as we saw it, of trade policy indexes that were commonly in use at the time. A well-known example of this is that trade-weighted average tariffs automatically are going to give small weight to high tariffs because of the substitution effect. So this seems somehow wrong, but wrong relative to what? Less well known, but at the time, we're talking about the late 80s, early 90s, trade policy shops like the World Bank were also using tariff variances and the coefficient of variation of tariffs in order to evaluate trade policy moves by their clients in developing countries. So, well, dispersion of a tariff schedule seems possibly significant, but in what way? Why are you going to use a variance or a coefficient of variation? So the practical motivation justified looking at this problem, but I actually think our real motivation for committing to the project was our sense that there would be beauty in the solution of the problems that were posed. So Peter's enthusiasm for economics has more of this sense of a search for beauty than any other economist I've known. And this quality above all made him a great co-author, as well as a great friend. The elegant modeling that we see in many of his papers, which Tony has just described very nicely for us, I think is just an exhorting example of how we can aspire, at least, to do good economics. So anyway, in the Trade Policy Index project, we faced setting up and solving a sequence of problems that are presented by finding a scalar equivalent, which is going to be the index, that's going to be equivalent to a given change in a vector of trade policies, such as you would see in a sort of incremental reform in data, or in a hypothetical move, let's say, maybe even to something as remote as free trade. And so equivalence here means it's being defined relative to an objective, which should be based on the purpose for which you're going to use the index. So in the trade policy case, we saw two obvious objectives as welfare equivalence and market access equivalence. So the trade restrictiveness indexes that we developed are interpreted as a welfare equivalent uniform tariff and a market access equivalent uniform tariffs. And so these indexes, conceptually at least, should be comparable across countries and over time, and therefore could be used for various purposes following from that. And so this work has had some influence. And when we were at a period of maybe the limit of globalization, maybe tariffs didn't matter that much anymore, and so it wasn't so exciting, but maybe we're in a more exciting period now where protectionism is going to make us pay more attention to it. And particularly the fact that we're going to have a lot of more non-uniformity spreads in schedules is going to mean the tariff structure matters more. So anyway, our idea, the charm in the project was we wanted to apply the distance function logic, but apply it to a subspace of the prices and quantities that were going to be distorted by trade policy. So the project is to take a sort of exogenous policy change vector, which could be actually a vector moving us all the way to free trade. That policy change is going to be shifting all the endogenous variables of whatever general equilibrium model of the economy we decided to apply it in. And so a preliminary problem that we faced was to develop a general characterization of the welfare effects of a vector of tariff and arbitrary vector of quota and tariff changes, and particularly worrying about the cross effects between them. So the result was our first sort of big publication together in Econometric in '92. It's kind of interesting to note that originally, the original version of this paper had gone on to apply these results on what, you know, a bunch of important derivatives looked like. We had gone on to apply that to setting up and characterizing the welfare equivalent trade restrictiveness index. The referees and the editor at the time decided that the latter topic was a distraction and not very interesting. So they wanted just the first part. So it's probably a good idea that they did that to us. And so after subsequent improvement in it that was associated with applications in a project that we had with the World Bank, this welfare equivalent index became the subject of a '96 paper, Review of Economic Studies. And as part of that World Bank project, we actually had a number of applications they were interested in, pushed us to do. We extended the policy considerations to include the trade restrictiveness implications of domestic production and consumption subsidies, which are actually important for some countries, including Mexico, which was our example. And so this resulted in a '95 IER paper. And then finally, a good bit later, by the time it got actually published, we were considering market access or trade volume as a constraint on policies that has to do with WTO obligations. And so if you're going to change your trade policy, you should not be taking away market access under your WTO obligations. So the index that's appropriate for this purpose and other purposes as well, presumably, was what we called the mercantilist trade restrictiveness index. And the mercantilist in the title got in there because at the time we wrote it, we hadn't fully appreciated the Bagwell and Steger sort of view of there's a kind of economic rationale behind this mutual exchange of market access, the logic behind the GATT and the WTO. So all of these indexes pose a kind of interesting technical problem, which is maybe part of the charm of working on this. So we can't use degree one homogeneity of the expenditure and GDP functions in the full vector of the arguments because we are only restricted. You want moving around a subset of them. And then, of course, you have this endogenous reaction of the remaining arguments to the things you're moving about that constitutes a kind of the technical aspects of the problem. So the stream of papers that came from this project includes some I didn't detail. And so these, along with some other supporting material and extensions, were all collected in our 2005 book. Well, I'll conclude with saying that some subsequent work, the trade restrictiveness indexes are very appealing in concept, but they're operational only with an applied general equilibrium model that you're going to then compute. And so thus they're heavily model dependent. But subsequently, we discovered sufficient statistics versions of these trade restrictiveness indexes that are, in principle, less model dependent. And this came about as a byproduct of our continued attempts to really understand the structure of these indexes. And so we found conditions under which combinations of observable tariff averages and variances were actually sufficient statistics. And this discovery actually linked back to the earlier intuitive but ad hoc measures that motivated the project in the first place. They'd been used by the World Bank. There was always something right about what they were doing, but there was also stuff that was wrong. And so this was a kind of completing the circle back that was quite pleasing to us. And so based on these developments with sufficient statistics, we subsequently produced 2 papers on operational methods for describing welfare improving policy reform rules. And so our 2007 JIE paper identified a cone of welfare improving tariff reform, included all the previously known paths. So there were some papers that had laid out, well, if you did this particular path in the space of tariffs, then you could guarantee under sufficient conditions that this would improve welfare. We were able to describe a cone that contained all the previously known ones and do it under much less restrictive sufficient conditions. And it was all basically using this logic that we got from the sufficient statistics approach. And then in 2016, we had a paper where we added a balanced budget constraint, so that whatever policy change you put in had to not reduce the government's revenue. And so again, we were able to derive descriptions of cones of welfare improving tariff and tariff cum wage tax reform that were defined by sufficient statistics again. And in the latter case, of course, we needed a small number of elasticities. And so this gradual reform work so far, in terms of citations test, doesn't seem to have had much influence, but it still pleases me every time I pick it up again to teach some of it. And so I'm just going to conclude by saying that this pleasure is a pleasure that's been through all of my collaboration with Neary. It's enhanced my love of economics. It certainly enhanced my appreciation for the beauty to be found in doing it. And hopefully we've contributed some useful objects as well. Our great friendship, I have to say, has greatly enriched my life. Thanks for everything. I'll hand it back now to Ron Davies for the remainder of the program.
So thanks for that, Jim and Tony. So now we're going to move more towards away from the macro, a little more towards the micro, and talk a bit about the trade and industrial organization work that Peter has been involved in. And so we've got 2 speakers for that part of it, Dermot Leahy and Karsten Epple. So Dermot, why don't you start us off?
I'm just going to share the screen there. Okay. Well, just before I start, can I just say that I consider myself extremely lucky to be one of Peter's co-authors. And that's not just from a professional point of view. Obviously, I've gained enormously from a professional point of view. Just leaving that aside, anyone who just working with Peter is just incredibly enjoyable, you know, as a process. And I think anyone who's either met Peter or even been present at his fantastic conference presentations would know how inspiring and how enthusiastic and how full of energy he is. So really working with Peter is just an absolute joy. I can't describe it as anything else. Also, I was actually a student of Peter's as well. I was a PhD student of Peter's, and I was actually even a master's student of Peter's. So I'm quite aware of some of his earlier work as well, which I'm very much a fan of. I just find his elegant modeling approach is just wonderful, you know, just something to aspire to, really. Anyway, I'll just talk a little bit about Peter on oligopoly and trade. So this is the first set of slides, but it won't be the last of the slides today, I think. Okay. So, okay. So I'm going to focus on his work on oligopoly and trade, and but it's worth pointing out that he's also made important contributions to oligopoly and industrial organization, and in particular in the area of R&D games and closed economies. But I just won't have time to talk about that now. My very brief discussion is just going to be under these 3 headings, really, which is the first heading is really the early work on export subsidies and helping winners, and then I'm going to talk about the trade in general oligopolistic equilibrium, because I want to make sure I say something about that. Unfortunately, I didn't work on that, or haven't worked on that with him, but I'm a great admirer of that particular contribution. I think it's probably his most important contribution in oligopoly and trade. And finally, I talk a little bit about strategic trade and investment games. Okay, so I'm obviously going to have to be brief because he's got an enormous literature on oligopoly in trade. And these are only the published journal articles, not including everything else. So obviously I can only really skim the surface of this. So just to go back to the very beginning of Peter's interest in oligopoly, I think this first paper was in 1988, and it was part of a study of export subsidies under both perfect competition and oligopoly. It was then followed by his 91 paper, which is it's in a book on export subsidies under price competition. But the most influential of the early papers is, without a doubt, cost asymmetries in international subsidy games. Should governments help winners or losers? Should they pick winners, or should they help weaker firms? So this paper is basically about cost competitiveness of firms and strategic trade policy. I suppose that's the main thing it's about. But as well as that, there's more in it as well. He introduced the social cost of funds into strategic trade. And he also had learning by doing in that paper. I think that was the first time that was introduced into international trade, into oligopoly in international trade. So he had the social cost of funds in there. And so this social cost of funds reflects the deadweight cost of raising taxes to finance a subsidy. And he shows that the case for the subsidy disappears for a social cost of funds well within the empirically plausible range. So, but I suppose the main feature of the paper there is that he's talking about cost competitiveness and strategic trade. And what he finds is that the lower the cost the firm has, the more you want to subsidize it, basically. That lower cost firms have a comparative advantage, as he calls it, in rent shifting. And this comes from the idea that they've got a higher margin, and so there's a greater benefit from expanding their output. You're going to shift more rent by helping firms like that. And anyway, the helping winners result actually then is the foundation for some later work that I did with Peter on learning by doing, for instance. Insofar as if you imagine that if firms are learning, then they have a greater incentive to learn, to get their costs down, to be more worthy of being subsidized. So we looked at that. Now I want to, because I don't have much time, I want to quickly go on to goal, which is oligopoly in general equilibrium. So, okay, so goal is Peter's approach to embedding oligopoly in general equilibrium. And before goal, it was viewed as a very difficult problem because firms who were playing strategically against each other would, it seemed, have to take into account general equilibrium features, and such as their effect on wages, such as their effect on national income, and so forth. But Peter gets around that with his idea of the large and the small, but the small and the large. So the firms are playing strategically against a small number of firms in their own sector. But at the same time, they're too small in the economy as a whole to influence such things as national income. Just in the terms of the technical side of that, so the model, this is the basic model. I'm following actually Neary 2016 for this, which is, I think, a good starting point if anyone who hasn't read Goal wants to start. Well, this builds on the continuum of sectors Ricardian model, the famous Dornbusch Fisher Samuelson 1977, but modified to allow for oligopoly in every sector. So you have this continuum of sectors indexed by Z between 0 and 1. And so your costs in the different sectors depend on the wages, the economy-wide wages, and your labor input requirements in those particular sectors. So the convention there is that the low Zs are the ones where the home country has a comparative advantage in, and the high Zs the ones where the foreign one has a comparative advantage. In terms of preferences, he assumes additive separability, and which means that the inverse demand depends on the own consumption in that sector and the marginal utility of income. So it's through the marginal utility of income that all the outside influences outside the sector impinge on demand. So often he assumes linear demands to solve explicitly, but you don't need that. And as he shows in Neary 2016, it works for a much wider class of preferences. Okay, and probably relates to something that Monica's probably going to talk about later on. So from the point of view of a firm in the goal model, it sees itself as being in a particular sector, competing in a Cournot manner on an integrated market. And it's taking the marginal utility of income as given. And it is competing with some firms just like itself, home firms just like itself at the same cost, and a certain number of foreign firms with a different cost. So this gives rise to different regions in cost base. So this diagram is very helpful. Stars are foreign, okay? So you've got your home costs on the vertical there and foreign costs on the horizontal. And so the space is divided up. And this locus here represents the cost combinations in the different sectors from 0 up to 1. And okay, so that's one locus that might represent those. It doesn't have to be there. It could be in various other places. But the point is that in this region here, foreign costs are high, home costs are low. In other words, in these sectors along here, and only home firms can survive. Whereas up here, only foreign firms. So F represents the region where only the foreign firms can survive. And in the cone in between here, we've got what Peter calls the cone of diversification, to use a phrase, where home and foreign firms coexist. So between Z equals, between these two threshold sectors, you get oligopoly, you get competition between home and foreign firms on an integrated market. Now, so this region is specific to oligopoly because under perfect competition, it would just collapse to the 45-degree line, clearly. Okay. Now, just talking about how you can apply this model then. So to autarky versus free trade. So just for simplicity, let's assume that the countries are symmetric. Now that doesn't mean they're identical because the comparative advantage applies. And let's suppose they always produce all goods. So that means that post-trade, we're going to be in that HF region, okay? And what happens when you open to trade is you get these pro-competitive and comparative advantage effects coming into force. The firms facing more competition in free trade, lowering the prices in all sectors. But in sectors where the home firms are more efficient, they will expand at the expense of foreign firms. And similarly, in the sectors where the foreign firms are more efficient, they'll expand. And so as a result, labor gets reallocated from the low to the high productivity sectors. So you get this comparative advantage effect, despite the fact that if we stay within the HF region, we don't get full specialization. So there's many applications of this model. So Peter and Joe Tarakan looked at applying it to the problem of endogenous mode of competition. And Peter has another paper where he's applied it to the trade and wages problem. But I'm just going to look quickly at a couple of papers where the number of firms matters. So he's got one paper in 2003 where he looks at what he calls competitive advantage. So competitive advantage means having more firms. So if the home country has more firms than the foreign country, it's got competitive advantage. So this could have arisen perhaps due to it having a stricter antitrust policy or something like that. So the competitive advantage then interacts with the comparative advantage, because in sectors where, because we have more home firms, foreign firms are driven out of some of the marginal sectors, right, where they're on the edge. As a result of that, the economy is gaining on the basis of due to the comparative advantage effect. Wages tend to rise, and then this tends to drive out some home firms in the in its marginal sectors as well. So you get this kind of interaction between the two effects. Another paper where the number of firms matters is Neary 2007, where he shows that trade liberalization actually encourages cross-border mergers. So, so if you remember, one of the ways out of the so-called merger paradox is that if firms have sufficiently different marginal costs, then the low-cost firm has an incentive to take over the high-cost firm. And that's what goes on here, because obviously, you know, in certain sectors, home firms have a big cost advantage, and in others, the foreign will have a cost advantage. So the result is that in those sectors, then the home firm, in those where the home firms have a cost advantage, they'll take over foreign firms and vice versa. So mergers actually generate FDI flows that are in the same direction as trade flows. Right. Okay, so now I'm just going to quickly go back to partial equilibrium, just talk a little bit about some papers I have with Peter and myself. So we looked at some papers on, we looked at some models on trade and industrial policy. So it's well known that the strategic argument for an export subsidy is sensitive to whether firms engage in quantity or price competition. So what we did was we explored what would happen with a strategic investment subsidy instead. So what we have is firms choosing investments, and they can be any types of investment you want, R&D, capital, marketing, whatever, and then choosing output or price. So the model is quite general. And the government set an investment subsidy at the beginning. So we show, for instance, when they're exporting to a third market, which is closest to the classic strategic trade setup, that the national optimality of investment subsidies turns out to be quite robust, quite different to that of export subsidies in strategic trade. And the global optimality depends mainly on whether the investments benefit or hurt the profits of other firms. We then extended it to bring in domestic consumption, which is what you're getting rid of when you assume third market. And that just further strengthens the argument for investment subsidies, in fact. Another issue that we looked at, again, going back, if you go back to the classic strategic trade papers, the optimality of export subsidies depends on the ability of governments to be able to commit in advance of firms. So what we did was we took our strategic trade and investment model and extended it to a large number of time periods, or a number of time periods, let's put it like that. It doesn't have to be large, it could be large. So in each period, the firm's decision variable might be output, price, R&D, marketing, whatever. And the home government is policy active, and it can set subsidies in more than one time period. So as a result, some of the actions of the firms are chosen for other actions of firms and subsidies. And the result is that they use their earlier actions to strategically manipulate the other firms and the subsidies. This turns out to be usually a wasteful thing. And so when setting earlier subsidies, the government needs to take this into account and correct for strategic behavior. So I'll just stop there then and pass on to Karsten. To stop sharing. Yeah.
Second. This is not working. Is it working? Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. I don't see me here though. This is weird. Okay. Hi, Peter. Hi, everybody out there. Hello, dear panelists. It's a great honor for me to join this celebration of Peter's contributions to economics. I just looked at some of the list of participants. It's amazing how many people are participating today. And so this is really a truly global event and makes me really glad. And as you can see, it's really not easy to cover all of Peter's work. It takes 6 co-authors. Even then, we're only getting a small glimpse at his work. So this is, let me try to contribute to this year. And not surprisingly, I will be focusing on our joint work with multiproduct firms. Now, Peter and I, we have co-authored 3 papers. The first one here was the theory paper, where we laid out the theory and studied the implications in partial and general equilibrium. The second and third papers were collaborations with Leo Iacovone and Beata Jaworczyk that had access to this great Mexican data set where we could take some of our predictions to data, and we discovered some puzzles, needed to extend our theories, and that led to this to these additional papers. Now, the total citations for these 3 papers right now on Google Scholar is 995, so roughly 1,000. This may sound a lot to some of you, but let me remind you that this is only about 5% of Peter's overall citations. So it's really just a small part of the contribution that I'm talking about here. So what do we do? What do we do with this research agenda, basically? The big question is, how does globalization affect what Peter liked to call the intra-firm extensive margin? So that's the product range of multi-product firms. How many products are they producing, and how does this range change in response to globalization? Now, this.
Sorry to interrupt. I don't think we see your slides.
Okay, let me go back to that. Okay, you're not seeing the slides. Okay.
It's a tabula rasa.
Yeah, it's a whiteboard, and then I saw a pen.
You're not seeing anything. Okay, let me see here. We can get this done here. So, are you seeing it now? Now you're seeing it. Now you're seeing the slides?
Yes. It wouldn't be a Zoom call if something didn't go awry. At least you're not a cat.
Okay, great. So, so I was talking about the 3 publications that we had. Those were the 3 papers, and the overall 5% basically of citations that Peter generated here. So the first one was the theory paper that we wrote first, and then the second and third are the papers that we did jointly with Leo Iacovone and Beata Jaworczyk. Now, let me come to this to the core question here of the product of this research agenda. So, how does globalization affect the intra-firm extensive margin? Now, this was really a research agenda that fitted very nicely into Peter's overall interest, because we were thinking about multi-product firms as large firms with market power. And as you've just heard from demo, that was something that Peter was thinking about a lot. And so we were drawing on his previous work a lot. And you will probably hear this a lot as we go on in the list of co-authors, that we were benefiting from some of the work that he's done before and the experiences he was bringing to these projects. So we were doing this in a kind of like in a Cournot oligopoly setting with horizontally differentiated products and linear demands, very different from the standard monopolistically competitive CES type model that would be the workhorse model and probably still is in trade theory. Now, the interesting thing about this, this modeling is that if you think of firms as engaging in strategic interactions and having market power, it means for a multi-product firms that they're not only engaging in strategic interactions with each other, but they're also taking into account the kind of demand linkages that exist between products. So if I'm introducing a new product or if I'm expanding an existing product, I'm not only looking at how that affects my revenues of that product, I'm also taking into account as a big firm, how these new products may take away some of the demand from other products that I'm producing. And that, of course, is the technical term for that, known for a long time, is called the cannibalization effect. Now, on the firm side, we also wanted to link these products in a specific way, and we used technology that had become known as flexible manufacturing. So the idea here is that firms possess a core competence in one particular product. So that's the product that they are really good at. And so they have the lowest marginal cost. They're really efficient in producing that core competence product. But they can add products to the product range. But every product that they add moves them away a little from their core competence. And that means that they're getting less and less efficient as they add new products. And so that means that the marginal cost for all of these additional products is then increasing in the product range. And it's probably easiest if I just show you this picture here that has the equilibrium price and output profile that you would get for a multi-product firm like the ones that we were modeling. Down here you have the product range on this axis, and here you can see our flexible manufacturing schedule. You have the core competence variety. That's the variety down here that has the lowest marginal cost for that firm, and the firm can extend its product range, but as it is extending, the marginal costs are increasing. Now the firm is choosing optimal outputs. Every product, they're choosing an optimal output, and that means that for low marginal cost, they're choosing high outputs, and for high marginal cost, they're choosing low outputs. So you get this dashed line here as the output profile. And that's already interesting because it tells you that a multi-product firm would not have some kind of like a symmetric overview over symmetric product outputs. It has this downward sloping profile of outputs. And the aggregate output of the firm is then basically just the triangle here below this dashed line. You can also see the price line over here. That will become important a little later on. Now the prices are just markups over marginal cost, and as Cournot oligopolists, we know that if marginal costs are increasing, with linear demands in particular, they're passing exactly half of that on. So the price schedule has half of the slope of the marginal cost schedule. You can see here, of course, the fact that there is a positive markup here, even for the marginal product, is of course due to the fact that this is the firm takes the cannibalization effect into account, and the marginal revenue for the first unit is even smaller than the price. Now, this is basically a view of the firm. It tells you prices and outputs within a single firm. Now, we would have that in an industry equilibrium with a fixed number of firms as an oligopolistic equilibrium. And then we would shock that equilibrium with a globalization shock. And the idea that we had is that there is an increase in the number of countries, a very simple globalization shock that many of us have used before. And has interesting implications in this framework, because every country brings new consumers to the market, but it also brings their firms to the market. So there is a demand effect and a competition effect. And it turns out that the demand effect and the competition effect affects the products within the product range asymmetrically. And as a response, we see this rotation of this output profile, and the firm is dropping some of the products at the periphery. It's becoming smaller in a smaller product range. It's pruning its product range, but at the core, it's becoming more aggressive. It's producing larger outputs here of their core competency products. And Peter likes to coin these terms, and leaner and meaner is clearly one of Peter's invention here. So that leaner and meaner profile means that firms are becoming smaller at the periphery, but becoming larger in outputs at the core. Now, as Deborah has already mentioned, we took this then into general oligopolistic equilibrium, and that was actually where we could see most of the difference to the standard monopolistically competitive CES type framework. The first difference was that if you have that globalization shock, wages can actually fall if that competition effect is very strong. And since firms are pruning their product range, they're letting go of those products that are using most of the labor. They are using the labor-intensive products. And so that can actually lead to reduction in the labor demand and have wages fall. If the demand effect, on the other hand, is very strong, then the wages will increase, and that will actually intensify this leaner and meaner profile, because an increase in the wage hurts particularly the peripheral product and gives a relative advantage to the more core products. And an interesting result also is that the total number of varieties, that is the number of varieties that are available for consumers for consumption, can actually fall in response to globalization. And that's also something that we would typically not see in standard monopolistically competitive models. We had some extensions, free entry, heterogeneous firms. I don't want to get into this here in detail. So this was the theory paper. And then at that time, while we were working on this, Peter had moved to Oxford, and Beata had just started in Oxford as well. And so the two started talking, and they realized that they could take some of our, using Beata's and Leo's data set, we could somehow take some of the predictions that we had to data. Some of them worked beautifully, but some of them created a puzzle, and particularly the price profile. If you remember, we go back to this diagram, you see here our theory would predict that prices are lowest for the core product. But that's not what we would find in the data. The core products did not always have the lowest prices. And so we needed to think about this. And what we did is we extended our model with endogenous investment and perceived quality. And that was, again, right up and down Peter's alley, because he had worked on this endogenous sunk cost literature before with Dermot, and we could really draw on his expertise here. We were thinking of two different types of investment, a brand-specific investment and a product-specific investment. And it turned out that we could come up with a very nice prediction that was then supported by the data, is that firms would actually enter markets with a quality-based competence, so very intensively investing in this quality, in particular for differentiated products, whereas they would enter markets more on a cost-based competence for more homogeneous types of products. Well, okay, so this is just a very quick overview over the work that we've done. But we're here to celebrate Peter's work. So let's celebrate Peter's work. Now, Peter is really a true multi-product researcher, not only because he's doing research on multi-product firms, but because he's bringing all these numerous competences to the table into the projects. His expertise in IO and trade theory, in utility theory, in index numbers, that was all extremely useful in these projects. When we were talking about all these investments, so this is a little word cloud here that has all the words, all the 3 papers combined. And so you can see all the buzzwords here. Investment is here. That's the one where we were doing all the endogenous kind of investments in brand quality. We have the modeling in the utility function of quality, where we could draw on Peter's expertise in utility theory. And of course, when we want to measure productivity in multi-product firms, we could rely on his knowledge in index numbers and how to actually write out a Divisia index. I had to go to Wikipedia first to check what that actually is. Okay, so that was really cool. And we all know Peter as a very enthusiastic theorist who likes mathematical modeling. But we've had that before. I mentioned this already. There's something else that Peter really likes, and that's coining terms. So it reminded me a little of a cartoon by Sidney Harris that I had seen. A breakthrough is not a breakthrough unless you coin a term for it. And Peter was really good at coining these terms. Peter's terms, they were usually a very resourceful mixture of mathematical expressions and economic intuition, spiced with just a little bit of popular culture. And so for his audiences during talks, and for the reader that were reading his papers, and of course for his co-authors, this expertise was actually a big treat. And finally, I was asked a lot, what's it like to work with Peter? We all know Peter as an enthusiastic economist who is very enthusiastic and loves his work. And so this is actually, this email that I put up here from 2004 is actually a very nice example of this. So earlier that day, I had received an email from Peter where he was saying that he really couldn't work on this anymore because they were leaving for their family vacation the next day, and he had to do some preparation for this. And throughout the day, I was getting more and more emails with more calculations and new equations. He just couldn't let go in this project. And so at some point, and this is the last email, I have to stop this, though it is just too much fun. So it's very funny. And then I would be getting all these pages of calculations where Peter was looking at the various models from different angles and really trying to get to the bottom of it all. So we were fighting the curse of Aberlourne. We were trying to find new rooms in Hilbert's hotel for our multi-product firms. And so what's it like working with Peter? It's really like attending a rock concert. You're completely drawn into this different world until you find yourself slam dancing to the rhythm of the equations, while Peter is playing some of the old hits with new interpretations, and as well coming up with impromptu creations of very entirely new sounds. So it's really a lot of fun. Now, I'm coming to an end, but I cannot talk about Peter's contribution without the impact that he has had on me and our joint work has had on me. Now, Peter, you've been an extremely generous mentor for me through all these years, and we've become very good friends. Calling you my friend is one of the great honors of my life, and I'm very, very grateful for this. It's actually kind of a funny paradox, and I know you like some paradoxes, but without you, I would not be standing here praising your contributions to a global audience. Thank you very much. And with this, I pass on back to Ron.
Thank you for that, Carsten. That was great. Although I doubt you would last long in the actual mosh pit. So anyway, so why don't we switch gears a little bit and look to Peter's work on consumer preferences, index numbers, and how all of those come back to trade. So we're going to start with Ian Crawford and then go on to Monica Razova. I always screw that up, Monica. I'm sorry. So Ian, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ron, and thanks to all of you for inviting me to take part. So it's a great honor. I'm empirical person, and Peter's primarily thought of as a theorist, but he never minded getting his hands dirty with data. And Joe Stiglitz referred to the fact that Peter could easily have become a macroeconomist. It's worse than that. Peter could have become an econometrician. His first two publications were both in the Economic and Social Review. The first one on, I have it here, relative efficiencies of absolute data and first differences in regression analysis, the case of autocorrelated disturbances. So not just econometrics, time series. And then he had another one on heteroscedasticity and cross-section regressions estimated from Irish county data. And I have to thank Kevin O'Rourke for this. He even pointed me to an econometric manual that Peter wrote, I presume while still a student. Anyway, as you'll all know, the econometric period didn't last, not for too long, but he did keep an interest in data. And I think through his interest in trade and, as has been referred to, his deep knowledge of utility theory, consumer theory, that led to what I think of as Peter's guilty pleasure, which is multilateral index number theory. Not just index number theory, mind you, but multilateral index number theory. We are talking a nerdy niche within a nerdy field. And I think Peter takes delight in that. But anyone interested in international comparisons and international data generally needs multilateral index numbers. So in the field of multilateral index numbers, many things are possible. Quite a lot of things are reasonable, but very few things are compelling. And it's one of those areas where perhaps practice ran ahead of theory. You know, there were people out there doing stuff. Peter, being a theorist, wasn't terribly happy with this. So his starting point was the work of another great Irishman, R.C. Geary. And Geary developed, after whom, of course, the institute at UCD is named. Geary developed one of the most widely used methods for comparing international incomes across countries by correcting for price differences. And Geary's method underlies the Penn World tables, which everybody who works in empirical work on trade knows. So I mentioned Geary. It's worth mentioning in passing that when Peter was in Oxford, he became the possibly self-appointed curator of the collection of great economists who are Irish, but who lots of people think of as being Brits. Peter was first to note if somebody ever accused a famous Irish economist of being a Brit. And it's quite a list. It's got Edgeworth and Geary and Terence Gorman in it. Peter referred to Gorman as the greatest Irish economist since Edgeworth. I think that's because Geary was more of a statistician. But Peter's probably the greatest Irish economist since Gorman, and Gorman didn't publish a lot. So maybe Peter's the one who deserves that particular accolade, because Peter publishes a lot. So in that paper, he set out to do two things. He wanted to provide a theoretical foundation for what Geary suggested, and he also wanted to provide a practical toolkit. So he published two warm-up papers reviewing what Geary had done and developing some empirical method. And then he produced a really very beautiful piece of work in the AER. This was called Rationalizing the Penn World Tables, True Multilateral Indices for International Comparisons. And what he did was he introduced the Geary-Allen international accounts. It's already been noted that Peter likes to coin a phrase, so he called this the Gaia index or the Gaia index. And it gives you a set of index numbers which equals the real income of a group of countries, takes into account differences in purchasing power, but, and this was Peter's bit, at the same time maintains coherence with economic theory, which was absent from what Geary had done. So as the name suggests, the Geary-Allen system produces true utility-based indices in the tradition of Roy Allen. Each country's real income relative to another country is the ratio of the minimum expenditure needed to obtain that country's utility, but at, and this is the connection with Geary, but at a set of world prices. It was Geary that introduced the idea of world prices. And so Peter showed how to construct this object with the proper theoretical underpinning and to set up a system of international accounts based on an international reference consumer, not a representative consumer. Peter's too smart to fall for that one, and in something which knitted the whole thing together and for the first time kind of added up. So it's a great piece of work, and it uses economic theory to solve an important empirical problem. I first met Peter at UCL probably in the mid-80s, and he presented an early version of that paper. Sorry, mid-90s, I'm not that old. I spoke to Peter about it, and in that conversation laid the groundwork for some work that we then did, which came out looking at these reference consumers. And anyway, in that conversation, he gave me the two fundamental facts of index number theories. I was telling him very earnestly what I thought about his paper, and he said, well, that's all very well, but you've really got to remember there's only two things that you have to understand. And then if you understand them, you'll understand index number theory completely. One fact is theoretical, the other one's empirical. Now, the theoretical fact is that all index number formulae are different in very important ways. The empirical fact is that none of that matters in the least because they all come out the same. Peter, of course, was joking because but being a theorist with an interest in data, he knows that whilst the first fact is correct, the second one's not. And he followed that paper up with a sort of companion piece in EJ called Who Shrunk China? And this was work that he did with Rob Feenstra and Prasad Rao and Holmar. And it was another empirical paper. Again, we think of Peter as a theorist. This was an empirical paper informed by what Peter had done on the Geary-Allen approach. And what they showed was that real GDP in China relative to the US was quite plausibly 30% higher than estimated by the World Bank. So it's another example of Peter doing empirical work, changing the way we see the world. And I think that's pretty good for someone who self-identifies as a theorist. When I first met Peter, I was a PhD student sitting in the audience in UCL, and it was very inspiring. Peter's a great presenter of work. He's a very engaging speaker, as has already been mentioned. But at the time, there was often a huge chasm between theory and empirical work in a paper. Often that you just invoke the theory to say that the result was ambiguous and justify some empirical work, which was designed to clear up the matter, which it rarely did, I suppose. In Peter's work, and the thing that really struck me in his empirical work, that it really tasted of being empirical work done by a theorist, because the gap between the theory and what he chose, the empirical choices he made, was minuscule. Every theoretical idea had an empirical counterpart. Every empirical choice he made was informed by the theory. And that struck me as, well, it struck me deeply, and it's had an enduring influence on the way I, and then I guess through me, some of my students do their work. We're all trying to emulate what Peter did and getting the theory and the data closer together, or as close together as possible. So I'll talk a little bit to finish up with about Peter's most recent stuff on index numbers. His most recently accepted paper, I say that because it was accepted probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, but Peter's pretty productive. He might have had something else accepted between now and then. It's in the Review of Economics and Statistics, and it's on new characteristics and hedonic price indices. But it invokes some ideas in a paper that he wrote with Kevin Roberts, which Jim has already mentioned. This was the theory of household behaviour under rationing, which came out in the EER in 1980. I'm slightly obsessed with that paper. It's a gem. And like Jim, I've relied on the insights that you get from it regularly. It should be better known. And some of the ideas in Peter's and Kevin's work then on rationing and consumer behaviour when people are constrained, not just by the budget constraint, fed into thinking about how you allow for quality improvements on the extensive margin in price indices. So when quality is changing, these days we routinely use hedonic methods to price those characteristics, and then as the characteristics change, you can price that change using the shadow prices of the characteristics. It's straight out of Terence Gorman's linear characteristic model. But what, asks Peter, happens if a product acquires a new characteristic? Under the normal hedonic method, what you need to do is you need to know what the shadow price of that characteristic was yesterday, but that characteristic didn't exist yesterday. And what Peter does in that paper is he provides, of course, a theoretically well-founded solution to another practical real-world index number problem. So whilst the world considers Peter to be a trade theorist, that's his day job, and in fairness, it is his trade job, he's also interested in empirical work. He doesn't write papers about serial correlation in time series anymore, but he still indulges his guilty pleasure in index number. And it's been tremendous fun. I think fun's the word that all of his co-authors have used, and I've been lucky enough to write 2 papers with Peter, and they have both been enormous fun to work on. Thanks.
Great, thanks for that. Monica, would you like to take over?
Yes, okay, so thank you very much to the organizers for including me in this celebration of Peter's achievements. It's a great honor. So I will share screen as well. Okay, so can you see my screen now? Okay, great. Okay, so a lot has been already said about Peter's contributions and about how a great researcher and also a great person he is. So I don't want to be repetitive, but I guess I can summarize that Peter is a true gem in the profession. Now, as you may know, precious stones get graded according to 3 C criterion: cut, color, and clarity. So I have 2 goals in this presentation. Okay, first, I want to give you a kind of flavor of the work that we've been working on with Peter in the last few years. But I also want to show you how Peter scores on an academic equivalent of the 3 C criteria. So I started, I first met Peter in Oxford as a graduate student, where he very kindly accepted to co-supervise my PhD thesis on trade agreements. And towards the end of my thesis, we kind of agreed that we will work together on a project on trade agreements. And the question that we wanted to explore was how globalization affects trade agreements. But it turns out that we stumbled, okay? And I can say this because I know that Peter used this in his introduction, when in his presentations at conferences of our first project. So it turned out that the problem we wanted to tackle was really hard, but that's not the only reason. And I would say it's not even the main reason, because it's not that we just stumbled full stop, but we stumbled upon some fascinating implications of demand properties for the behavior of models of monopolistic competition with heterogeneous firms. And we said, oh, this is so fascinating, we need to explore this more. So we set trade agreements to the side and we started to work on models of heterogeneous firms. And so this brings me to the first of the 3 C's of Peter's qualities as an academic researcher, which is his curiosity. Okay, he has this unquenchable thirst for really understanding every tiny detail of a question. And in his own words, as he would put it, research is about science, not about citations. So he really wants to understand everything about a research question, and doesn't matter whether it will publish well or whether this will interest someone else. Okay. And so we set trade agreements to the side and we started working on models of monopolistic competition with heterogeneous firms. Roughly 10 years later, okay, we've looked at different aspects of this question. Now, I won't have the time to go to the details of all these different papers, but I will try to give you just a flavor of the approach that we've developed. Okay, so I can introduce the approach on a very simple model, basic model of a monopoly firm facing an inverse demand function, a downward sloping demand function. Now, this will be consistent with monopolistic competition, where the firm will take demand function as given. Now, in general or industry equilibrium, this demand function will depend on other arguments, but I won't have the time to go into the details now. Now, on the technology side, the firm is producing with fixed marginal cost. So we can write down the first order and second order conditions for profit maximization. Okay, so standard first order condition, second order condition. Now these two conditions can be rewritten using the elasticity and the convexity of the demand function in the following ways. Okay, so this is the first order condition, and then the second order condition, we can express it as a function of the convexity of the demand. So what you can see from these two conditions, they depend on two key parameters of the demand function, the elasticity and the convexity. And as we realized, actually many properties of the models of monopolistic competition with heterogeneous firms depend on these two characteristics, these two key parameters of the demand. So we had this idea about, well, how about we represent demand functions in this elasticity convexity space? Okay, so the elasticity from the first order condition, we know that it has to be greater than 1. Okay, so anything that's in this shaded region is not admissible. From the second order condition, we know that the convexity has to be smaller than 2. So again, the shaded region is not admissible. And so we will be representing the demand functions in this admissible region, in this space that's not shaded in blue. Now, so the representation of demand function in this epsilon rho space, we call it the demand manifold. In general, the elasticity, both the elasticity and the convexity vary with sales. So we will get a curve. Okay, so if I show you a few examples, this is how the manifold looks like for a linear demand. This is how it looks for the Cara demand, linear expenditure system, and translog. Now, a notable exception is the constant elasticity of substitution case, where both the elasticity and the convexity are constants. We get a very simple relationship of the elasticity to convexity, and the manifold of this demand is this point. Okay, so this it's a point manifold because we have only one constant elasticity and constant convexity. Now, if we take a different sigma, okay, we'll get a different elasticity, and we'll get another point and another point. So as we vary the values of sigma, we'll get lots of points, and we can draw what we call the CS locus, which represents all the different possible CS demand functions. Now, the CS locus, it plays a very crucial role. It's very important because it divides the admissible region into two regions. So what's to the left, now shaded in yellow, we call it the subconvex region. And so when a demand function, its manifold lies in this subconvex region, we call it that it's a subconvex demand. So subconvexity, it's a local property. It basically is that the demand is less convex than a CS demand with the same elasticity. Now, this is equivalent to log of P of X being concave in log of X. And it's also equivalent to the elasticity being decreasing in sales. In the literature, sometimes the subconvexity has been termed as the Marshall's second log of demand. It has been confirmed empirically, and theoretically it has been argued as the more plausible case. Now, if I now draw in this picture the 4 examples of the often frequently used demand functions that I've shown you before, they all lie in this subconvex region. So now, what do we do with this? Okay, so we explore different kind of the behavior of the models of monopolistic competition with heterogeneous firms with respect to different comparative statics questions using this demand manifold. So I will show you 2 very quick applications. Okay, the first one is competition effects. So we show that subconvexity is a sufficient and a necessary condition for what we call competition effects in the cross section, the fact that larger firms charge larger markups. And it's also, with additive separability, a necessary and sufficient condition for the fact that globalization will raise profits of larger firms and will reduce profits of smaller firms. Okay, so something that we call the Matthew effect. Now, another question that we explored was the question of proportional pass-through. Okay, so when there is a change in when there's a shock to the costs of production, how much of what's the percentage of this shock that gets passed into prices. So how large is d log p over d log c? Now, from the first order condition, we can express this as a function of the elasticity and convexity. Okay, notice that again, this depends only on these two parameters of demand. And we can, for example, determine what's the threshold for 100% or more pass-through. Okay? And as it's well known, to get exactly 100% pass-through, there is only one demand that gives you that, and that's the CS demand. Now, to get more than 100% pass-through, you need to lie in the superconvex region. Okay, so any demand that's superconvex will generate more than 100% pass-through, and any subconvex demand will generate less than 100% pass-through. Okay, so if I use the graph that I've shown you before, anything that's to the left, we will have less than 100% pass-through. Anything to the right of the CS locus will get more than 100% pass-through. Now, the next question we are interested in, well, okay, so CS gives us exactly 100% pass-through. What type of demand would give us another level, but a constant level of proportional pass-through? Okay, so say 40% or 50%. And so we explored this question, and this led us to discover a new, to our knowledge, a new family of demand functions, the CPPT family for constant proportional pass-through. Okay, so this is the expression, and then on the graph I've shown you the manifolds of these CPPT demands for different levels of pass-through. Okay, 10%, 20%, 30%, 50%. Now, this demand function is very interesting in itself. Okay, we are working on exploring its properties. It's an extension, is a generalization of the CS demand function, which allows for variable markups. But these manifolds are interesting also for another reason, because you can think of them as being the contour lines of different levels of constant proportional pass-through. Okay, and you can superimpose them with your favorite demand, and this will give you information about the pass-through behavior of a model that you would write with your favorite demand function. Okay, so if I, for example, put in this diagram the linear demand, well, I've already told you that with linear you will get less than 100% pass-through, but what this shows you is that larger firms who face lower elasticity will have lower pass-through, whereas smaller firms who face higher levels of elasticity will have higher pass-through. Same goes for Cara. For LES, interestingly, LES coincides with the contour line corresponding to 50% pass-through. Okay, so for LES, independently of the size of the firms, all firms will always have 50% pass-through. And then finally, translog. So for translog, the translog manifold always lies above the 50% pass-through level. Okay, so you will always get more than 50%, no matter how large the firms or how large or small the firms are. Now, I now need to add one additional contour line. Okay, this will start to get a little bit cramped, but if you can see it, I've added the 60% pass-through contour line. And from here, I hope you can see it, is that for low levels of elasticity, the translog manifold lies above the 60% contour line, whereas it lies below for high levels of elasticity. So what this tells us is that very large firms who face low levels of elasticity will have higher pass-through than smaller firms who face higher levels of elasticity. Now, this, as I was saying, this is a little bit cramped, okay? And this brings me to the second of the three C's of Peter. Peter is extremely careful in the sense he has an unbelievable attention to detail, and in other words, he's a perfectionist. Okay, so I know, Peter, I agree with you. This is not ideal that this label didn't fit entirely. Okay, but we will do it better next time. And so just to, as Peter would often tell me when I was a graduate student, labor theory of value does not apply to research. Okay? So no matter how much time you've spent on something, whether it's writing a paragraph or whether it's drawing a figure or setting up a table, if it's not perfect, if you know there is a better way, you need to redo it, get rid of it and start again. So this is Peter's second C. Now, so we've applied this approach to many other applications. I don't have time to talk about all of those, okay, but so we've explored absolute pass-through, which turned out to be very different from the question of proportional pass-through. We've explored the implications of demand properties for selection effects. Okay, so when do we get conventional selection effects in the sense that more productive firms will, for example, select into doing FDI rather than exporting. And then most recently, we explored the implications of properties of demand for the links between distributions of firm characteristics and firm outcomes. So this was in a project with Mathieu Parenti. And finally, we've also explored the implications of subconvexity for gravity with Céline Carrère. So to conclude, I would like to, well, thank you, Peter. Thank you for the privilege and honor of working with you. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you for your kindness. It's been, as many co-authors said, it's been an enormous fun working with you. Thank you for all these eureka moments, amazing moments when we discover some result, something new, which Peter would invariably make even more memorable by an unforgettable statement. This will make us famous. Okay, so this brings me to the last C. Yes, as any great academic, Peter is also competitive, and yes, he also does care about citations. Okay, and just a little postscriptum. In the end, we did get back to trade agreements in a joint project with Giovanni Maggi. We explore the implications of red tape for trade agreements, where it turns out that the properties of demand function also play a crucial role. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Great, thank you for that. So, you know, we just had 6, 7 speakers talk about Peter's research, and we know we only scratched the surface. And his research is only part of the contribution he has made to the profession. So we would like to finish up by talking a little bit about what he's done in terms of economics in Ireland and UCD in particular. So we're going to hear from Cormac O'Grada, Rodney Tom, and Ian Irvine. So I'll pass it over to you, Cormac.
Thanks, Ron. John Kenneth Galbraith is responsible for the notion that Ireland never produced a world-beating economist. It's plainly ludicrous. But if we want to confine ourselves to a short list, I guess one would begin with Richard Cantillon, who maybe some would say was the originator of economics. And then I would include the people that Ian Crawford mentioned. Roy Geary, Terence Gorman, Frank Edgeworth, and not least, Peter Neary. For Irish economists, Peter Neary is their Seamus Heaney. He's their Roy Keane. He's their Bono. And wherever they've traveled over the last 40 years or so, the first question they're always asked is, hey, do you know Peter Neary? And thankfully, the answer in many cases is, yes, I do. And that has been a privilege. And I think what today's speakers have confirmed so eloquently is how privileged we Irish economists, that Peter is one of us. So we are very grateful to those who have spoken. We Irish economists are proud of you, Peter, as one of the very few fellows of the Econometric Society, as the only Irish president of the European Economic Association so far, and one of the 2 Irish presidents of the Royal Economic Society. And one might also mention, and it has been mentioned, that Peter was also the first director of the CEPR's very important trade program. Closer to home, we remember Peter as a president of the Irish Economic Association in the early 1990s, and also as a recipient of the Royal Irish Academy's Gold Medal, which is quite an accolade in Ireland in 2006. We put up with the fact that Peter has published more papers in top economic journals than all the rest of us put together. Many of us have enjoyed Peter's company over the years. He's always been generous with his company, and he's always been very generous with his time. Many of us have been taught and inspired by you. I think it should be emphasized how great a teacher Peter was, and how much effort Peter always put into his teaching. And that ranges from teaching mega classes in Theatre L in Belfield. Peter always came super prepared to teaching graduate students all over the globe. Now, I'm going to talk mostly about Peter in the third person. He was appointed a full professor in UCD in 1980, before he reached the age of 30, and that is something almost unprecedented in Irish academia. It should also be said that at that time, UCD did the right thing, as it were. Some decades earlier, it would not have behaved in that way. Nick Stern described Peter, his students' skill set very well. Peter, he said, and I'm quoting him here, brought very serious, tough theory to the problems that matter. And we've seen plenty evidence of that over the last 2 hours. Peter always knew he was good, but he also, I think, wanted to matter. Trade was clearly his comparative advantage from very early on. But Joe Stiglitz has talked about Peter's promise as a macroeconomist, and one can go further back. I have it on very good authority that Peter's math teachers in Clongowes, where he was a secondary school student, were absolutely terrified of him. Not because he was fierce or violent, but because he knew more than they did, and the people in his class knew that as well. So there was a certain amount of theatre and tension about teaching a class in which Peter was a student. Some of us are old enough to remember Peter as a budding econometrician. And Ian Crawford already mentioned the econometrics package that Peter put together at age 21 or 22, which was the mainstay of practicing economists in Ireland for several years, both in universities, in the central bank, and also in the Economic and Social Research Institute. And indeed, according to Paddy Geary, who knew Peter very well at that stage, and again, I'm quoting Paddy here, he says, econometrics and programming were his most obvious areas of expertise before he went to Oxford. And indeed, Peter himself told me that he was later congratulated on that software package, which he called RegRecon, by the famous civil servant and central banker T.K. Whitaker. And Peter quipped, and I'm quoting Peter here, I think it's the only quote I have from him, only afterwards did I think of saying that it was not intended to rival his program, meaning Ken Whitaker's program for economic expansion, which was, of course, one of Whitaker's main claims to fame. And you have a sign there of Peter's wit, and also of somebody who also always loved to laugh. On Christmas Eve in the year 2008, a headline in the Drogheda Independent read, "Drogheda native in British Who's Who list." Peter's reaction was typical. A great honor, he said, but more importantly, my mother is delighted. And that it was great to be included as one of what he called us Irish. And he added, appearing on any list alongside the latest James Bond and Dave Gilmour from Pink Floyd is hugely cool. That accolade led to Peter being included in the Irish Independent's Who'll Be Hot and Who'll Be Not in 2009. We in UCD were really sorry to lose our superstar to Oxford in 2006 after an innings of 26 years, which Rodney Thom will talk about now in a minute. But in a very real sense, Peter has never really left us. He has kept coming back to Ireland to meet family and friends and to present his work to seminars, to work with Dermot, of course. His seminars were always packed, and Peter would always hang around to enjoy the post-seminar convivialities, which he loved. So Peter, in enriching economics, you continue to enrich our lives as well. And we thank you for that. It's great. But on that note, because time is short, let me hand over to Ian Irvine, who is speaking to us from Montreal, where he is professor of economics at Concordia University. I should maybe add that Ian was one of Peter's best mates in a stellar year in UC long ago, and they have been friends ever since. And Ian is going to talk about that time they shared in UCD. Thanks a lot. Okay, Ron?
Ian, can you unmute yourself, please?
Good idea. Yes, I'm unmuted now. Sorry. Thank you, Ron. I've been trying to keep quiet all this time. Here I am. So thank you very much for asking me to participate in this absolutely wonderful occasion and communicate with Peter and all of my friends and colleagues, many of you whom I know. When I was asked to participate in this, I was just asked to reflect a little bit on the time that Peter and I and many others spent in UCD in the late 1960s and in the early 1970s. So I'm going to go off on a slightly different journey in the next 7 or 8 minutes relative to the explorations that some of you have described earlier on. I knew Peter very well as a first-year student, and first year was a bit of a mishmash, but by second year, about 30 odd of us found ourselves in what is called, or what was then called, Group 9, which was designed for students who were interested primarily in study economics, and that was also augmented with the study of statistics, politics, philosophy, which was another name for religion, I guess, at the time at University College Dublin. But we got to know one another terribly well, and what I'd really liked, the first thing I'd really like to say about knowing Peter at that time is to reflect upon Peter's mentors and our mentors and my mentors in UCD. Everybody this morning has spoken about how influential Peter has been to everybody who has ever crossed his path. At the start of our second year, economics in UCD had been a fairly, I think I can accurately describe it as by and large, fairly sleepy discipline. And the department was headed by James E. Meenan, who was an old school guy whom none of us knew terribly well, but he was obviously very aware of developments in the field of economics. He wanted to bring the department up to date, and he brought into the department a number of people who had just finished their PhDs or their graduate degrees overseas. I'm referring here in particular to Brendan Walsh, who was working in the ESRI. He came back from Boston College with his PhD, having taught in Rutgers. And he taught us macroeconomics, and the ISLM model was introduced in UCD undergraduate teaching for the first time in 1968. Dermot McAleese came back with his PhD from Johns Hopkins. He was a researcher in trade and development. I remember very vividly him trying to use the Arrow-Chenery-Minhasson-Solow, or succeeding in using the Arrow-Chenery-Minhasson-Solow CES production function, and explaining to us how people have tried to estimate the parameters of these things and how frontier knowledge and technological change could be implemented there. And then Moore MacDougall had just come back from Oxford with a wonderful Oxford gloss, I remember at the time, Mar Jeremy Dasguelga. And he taught us about inside money and high-powered money and all sorts of things in monetary economics, and delivered his lectures with much more respect to us than he probably should have. He always wore a gown and occasionally wore a mortarboard. So in addition to these new influences and fresh faces and up-to-date ideas being integrated in the program, there were a few other people in the program who were very influential too. Bill O'Riordan was a big man in methodology. And then there was the incomparable Des Norton, of course, who could only be described as sort of enthusiasm on steroids. But all of these people together, you know, whether we're talking about this particular group of people or the others around us, Helen and Jerry and Louis and Garrett and others, there was a tremendous enthusiasm on their part to impart what they knew about economics to us, and they had a tremendous willingness to give their time to us. I remember one evening in our second year in economics, I don't know if Peter was with me on this particular evening, but Des Norton had decided to take it upon himself to teach us linear programming. And he was very generous of his time. And there was one evening during the week, a group of us went up to his office at about 8:30 in Earlsford Terrace. And he proceeded to talk to us for about an hour before going for a pint in Kerwin's, of course. And he explained to us how to choose pivot elements when inverting a matrix. And he tried to explain to us what Lagrange multipliers were and how they could be interpreted as shadow prices. So Des was just an extraordinary source of enthusiasm. So I'd like to say, if I may, on behalf of Peter and all of the, and many of the other classmates of that time, John, Esna, Anne, Noel, Donald, Ben, Paul, William, Dave, Bernard, Joe, Kean, I'd like to say a big thank you to all our professors who mentored us and gave us our time, because they were the ones who ultimately influenced us to go on and be interested in economics. And I think a mark of the success of that group of teachers was that a huge number of us went on to use our economics in our everyday lives. We didn't just look upon an undergraduate degree in economics as being a stepping stone to something as banal as an MBA. In addition to this teaching environment, there was if I may, if it's not too pretentious to use the word, there was a wonderfully exciting intellectual environment around at the time. We had the Undergraduate Economics Student Association, and students used to present their papers there bi-weekly, or we'd get visiting speakers to come in. T.K. Whitaker came in one day. And there again, many of the faculty were very generous of their time in coming to those meetings and discussing issues of interest with us. We also, of course, had our own version of Saturday Night Live, and that took the form of the Literary and Historical Society, the LNH, which would meet every Saturday night, and about 500 students would cram into a 300 student lecture theatre. At least that's all the fire regulations allowed. And then people would stand up, of course, and it was mandatory to be witty and insightful, but we usually ended up just being a bit pretentious. But again, many of the faculty members visited there, and I remember our president, Michael D., being there on more than one occasion. And of course, inevitably, when 9 o'clock rolled around in the evening, a group of us would finish studying at about 9 o'clock, and we'd go off to one of the pubs in Leeson Street where we'd chat a bit more about the day's events, and then we'd head home and watch one of the Dimbleby brothers present 24 hours on the BBC, and then we'd come in and do the same thing the next day. So this was an absolutely wonderful, engaging student environment that Peter and I and many others lived in. And much of the responsibility for that goes to the people who taught in UCD. And I hope some of you are out there today. And I hope it's not too late 50 years after the event to be saying a thank you to you. I know that Peter would want me to do that. I'd like to say just two things on a personal level. One of them slightly embarrassing to myself, but I'll tell it anyway because it relates back to a number of things that were brought up earlier, and particularly an expression that Jim Anderson coined a short while ago. When we finished our bachelor's degrees, I think both Peter and I, we registered for the MA in UCD, which was not a terribly taxing undertaking at that time. I think he went off to work in the ESRI, and I wasn't sure what to do with myself. So I decided to go off to America for much of the first semester, having registered in the program. There's of course no such thing as midterm exams or assignments there. I'm sure there's a much stricter regime now under Ron, but in those days, you know, you just showed up and wrote the final exam and that was fine. So I went off to America to do a little bit of exploration there. I didn't end up doing anything terribly exciting. I got myself a job in downtown Baltimore. So this didn't quite compare with Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie or Jack Kerouac's On the Road, but nonetheless, it was a way of spending several weeks away. And when I came back to Dublin, of course, having missed a large part of the first term, I had to find a way of making up for all of those lectures that I had missed. I had lent a set of mine, I remember, so I had to borrow a set of notes, and you know where this story is going to go. When we were undergraduates, I had previously lent a whole load of my notes to Gerard Barry, the journalist, and he had spent 1 year of his undergraduate existence doing nothing but running the Literary and Historical Society, and he came along to me one day and he said, could you lend me some notes? So I lent him this scrawl, and he was particularly grateful to me for it. And I'm not saying that just as a self-serving thing. I'm just saying that as a means of comparing it with the notes that Peter Neary lent to me when I came back from my wanderings. Peter's notes were just extraordinary, and a number of you have already mentioned how meticulous and wonderful Peter is in the development of ideas and the recording of ideas. Monica, and I loved your expression, Jim Anderson, that for Peter, economics was a search for beauty. Well, you should have seen his undergraduate notes. They were sort of modern day Matisses. They were full of color, they were elegance, form, there was body, there was shape to them, there was flow to it. They were an absolute masterpiece, and I was absolutely overwhelmed when I cast my eyes on these lecture notes for the very first time. So Peter, if you're listening out there, I'm terribly grateful to you, and I feel slightly shameful in asking you to lend me those notes. But had you not lent me your lecture notes, I probably would have failed the master's degree and not gone on to graduate school, and I might instead have taken up a job with waste management in an outdoor capacity or something like that. So thank you, Peter. The last thing I want to say is an event that featured Peter and probably not many people remember or know about, and that is that Peter played this very interesting role during the what we've come to call the gentle revolution in UCD. At least that's the title Philip Pettit gave to the little book of essays that he got together on it. For those of you who are less familiar, we had our own student, I wouldn't call it an uprising, but we had our own student seminars in 1969, which was a good time to have it. And these seminars, and this, it was called a revolution, but it wasn't really. It was just an outpouring of, I think, frustration on the part of a lot of students with the conservatism that really dominated University College Dublin at the time and society at large, I think. And two of our economists, two of the economists in our class, Dave Grafton and Bernie Corliss, were very prominent in this. And Dave Grafton gave this marvelous speech one night in the Great Hall. I don't know if you were there, Cormac, to remember it, but it was a really gripping event. Now, the student leadership had been trying to engage the university leadership in some sort of dialogue, and we're trying to convince them to come along to one of these meetings that we had every evening in this huge hall, which is now the National Concert Hall in University College Dublin. And after about three days of these seminars and workshops and whatnot, the university administrators, Tom Murphy and a couple of pals, came along. They were obviously not very thrilled to be there, but they agreed to meet and talk about issues that were of concern to the students. And you know, they did an awful lot of eye rolling and eyebrow movement, and you know, they were you know, you think you were dealing with some medieval fiefs here who were trying to calm the serfs, or not really interested perhaps in the serfs' concerns. And who should find himself in the chair for this monster meeting was this Peter Neary. So I don't know how, Peter, you came to be the chair for this meeting, but I remember very vividly at one stage in the meeting, there was, I'll stop in 2 minutes, Ron. At one stage in the meeting, things were getting very fraught, and students were very frustrated, and the administrators weren't terribly interested in taking anything very seriously. And things were just on the verge of getting out of control. There were at least 1,000, maybe 2,000 students at this meeting. And Peter was the chair of the meeting, and he sort of drew things to a pause, and he made two comments. He addressed the students first off, and he said, you know, I understand the frustration here, but I'd like you to keep your comments to the main issues of debate and not wander too far from them. And so that was a pause, and then he turned around and he addressed himself to the administrators, and he basically rebuked them for not taking the whole event seriously. They were taken aback and responded a good deal more seriously after that to the issues that were being debated. So we're all aware of Peter's multitudinous talents, but I'm going to add to this that he might have been a politician and might have ended up as a House Speaker or a chairman in the Dáil or something like that had he chosen to go a different route. So I could talk endlessly. Peter, you are a wonderful friend. We've never written a paper together, but we communicate regularly with Christmas cards, emails, photographs of families, visits to each other from time to time. And so there you are. Congratulations, Peter, for being who you are.
Great, thank you for that. Rodney, would you like to finish this up for us?
Okay, thanks, Ron. Just when Ian finished there and said he had never written a paper with Peter, I just remembered I actually did write a paper with Peter. Peter, remember, it was called Pounds, Punts, and Euros. God knows what happened to it. I don't know. Anyway, just a few words on Peter and UCD. I joined UCD in 1977, a long time ago. Okay, I wasn't a student at UCD, so all the wonderful people that Ian talked about, they never taught me. My first impression of UCD was that while there were some good people there, there was, how can I put it, a limited interest among senior people in academic research and publication in refereed journals. I well remember the first day I arrived, the then head of department, I think he didn't really know who I was, despite the fact he had appointed me 3 months earlier. And when I asked him what I should teach, he said, oh, go and ask Paddy Geary. And that was that. Okay, however, things changed in 1980. The old guard retired and Peter and Brendan Walsh were appointed to the 2 senior chairs. For those of you who don't really know how UCD worked in those days, it may be difficult to understand how significant this was. 2 outsiders, 1 still under 30, were appointed in preference to, let's call them, representatives of the establishment. However, that's another story. In the years that followed, emphasis was put on research, publications, and workshops. Hiring seminars, which I think were all known in UCD to that point, were introduced. These changes in the structure and emphasis was in large measure due to Peter's drive and leadership. From day one, it was clear that his main interest was in UCD's future, not its past. Now, to go back to something Cormac said, I'd be fairly confident in saying that up to that point, UCD economics did not have a strong international reputation. But Peter helped to change that. I'll give you a simple example, okay? I remember being at a conference in Toronto, I think it was around 1984, 85. Okay. One night I was in the bar having a quiet Diet Coke when I got talking to Bennett McCallum. For those of you who are under 70, McCallum was a fairly prominent monetary economist at Carnegie Mellon. Okay. Notwithstanding that, when he asked me where I was from, and I told him University College Dublin, he immediately put his hand up and replied, ah, Peter Neary. Okay. That simple event always stuck with me because it made me realize just how important Peter was and how important he would be to both UCD and Irish economics. Now, I know that, of course, we have had lots of other really good, prominent people, Brendan Walsh, Cormac, people like Kevin O'Rourke, to mention a few. But I think Ron put it very nicely in his remarks when he said that Peter was different in that he added that infectious excitement. also encouragement and leadership. Okay, I could just add a few personal comments. Okay, I hope Peter doesn't take this the wrong way, but one thing I've never understood about Peter is his complete lack of interest in sport. But you know, none of us are perfect. Right? Okay, one story, which may or not be true, I hope it is because I sort of like it, is that on that famous Saturday in 1990, when Ireland were playing Italy in Giants Stadium, and 99.9% of the population were glued to their television screens, Peter was apparently seen walking up to Neary Pier, an almost deserted to Neary Pier. It may not be true, but I said, none of us are perfect. Okay, for more than a decade after joining UCD, Peter and Brendan rotated the headship of the department. However, in 1996, it was decided that they needed a rest, and I was selected as the new head. I did 2 3-year terms, returned in 2005 for another term before I was decommissioned and sent out to pasture. As a department, I think in terms of research output and hiring, we were fairly successful over that period. But that success was in large part due to the foundations and the philosophy that Peter had built and encouraged over the previous 20 years. I would also like to say that despite Peter's standing, at no point did he ever make demands on me, tell me what I should do, or tell me what I shouldn't do. However, his door was always open, and he was always willing to give advice and guidance if I asked for it. Any success I had in guiding the department was in no small way due to his support. In 2006, Peter told me he was applying for a chair in Oxford, and that as his head of department, I was required to give him a reference. That wasn't easy. I was asked to write an academic reference for someone with a stellar reputation, and his other referees probably had even more stellar reputations. However, it was a pleasure to do it. Of course, I didn't want Peter to leave, but I knew it was the right thing for him to do. Oxford would present him with more opportunities, more challenges than UCD ever could. And of course, his loss was immense, but he had taken us from relative obscurity to academic respectability and left us in a strong position. Peter is beyond doubt the leading Irish academic economist of his generation, and it was an honor to work with him. And I hope I speak for all those who worked with him at UCD and finish by simply saying, thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much for that, Rodney. So our final speaker today is going to be Mairead Hanrahan, who is Peter's wife. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I would like to say a few words, as just unfortunately Peter is not well enough to participate himself. I'm going to be very brief. I just want to say how grateful we are for this event. It has been a wonderful celebration of Peter as an economist. And indeed, for me, as a non-economist, it's been truly lovely to see what the tributes show, not only of the immense esteem with which he is regarded professionally, but also the great affection in which he's clearly held. And the event itself has said it all. The fact that so many people have chosen to spend 2 hours online recalling his achievements at a time when we're all heartily sick and tired of Zoom has frankly been humbling. Right, so a big thank you to you all. I want, of course, to say a special thank you to the speakers for sharing their admiration and especially their memories. It was so lovely and illuminating to get the very different perspectives from you. And above all, heartfelt thanks to the organisers, right, both within UCD and outside. Peter is very touched that you wanted to do this for him, and it will be a very precious memory for us all. So thank you so much.
Thank you. So let me simply wrap up by reiterating the thanks to all of our speakers. Let me thank the organizing committee, Cormac O'Grada, Kevin O'Rourke, Darren Leahy, David Madden, as well as Carl Whelan and myself. We will be sending out an email to everybody that registered that if you would like to express your own thanks by video or some other format, that we'll put something together and pass that on to Peter as well. And let me simply wrap up by saying thank you to Peter, you know, not just for the research, but for the inspiration, you know, the fierce intellect, the never-ending curiosity, and the utter enthusiasm. You know, that is why even after 2.5 hours, we've still got so many people here to express their gratitude and express their thanks for everything. So everybody, take care of yourselves. And thank you so much for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you.